Some suffering is too painful to see, too intense to imagine, and too difficult to understand. Picture a young boy coming back from school. He opens the door to his house only to see his entire family murdered. There is blood on the floor and the lifeless bodies of his family members just lying there. Where will he go now? Who does he have to share his pain with? All alone, with no one and nothing. This is the reality of the Rohingya people. The government of Myanmar launched a military campaign in 2017 against the Rohingya, forcing them to flee. The government denies the Rohingya citizenship. Even more so, they excluded them from the 2014 census, failing to acknowledge them as people. The fact is that the government views them as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. The Rohingya are living under highly atrocious conditions, enduring dire social, economic, and political inequalities. Furthermore, religious persecution resulting from the Rohingya being an ethno-religious minority in a predominantly Buddhist country fuels the government's attempt of an overall ethnic cleansing and genocide of this minority population. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya sought refuge in Bangladesh after troops burned their villages and attacked and murdered innocent civilians. Unquestionably, the horrific violence, brutality, and human rights violations drove the Rohingya people to find asylum in Bangladesh, Malaysia, India, Thailand, and Indonesia. Right groups even suspect that the government has committed mass genocide against the Rohingya. But as always, officials denied the allegations. According to a medical charity, approximately 6,700 Rohingya were brutally killed in the month following the violence. Well, the migration of the Rohingya across the region is dated since the 1970s, but in the last few years before the latest crisis, thousands of them made perilous trips out of Myanmar to flee the ongoing violence and abuses suffered at the hands of the military forces. Most of them don't even hold legal status and identity in Myanmar, to the extent that statelessness has become a growing concern. By September 2019, around 1,295,000 people were estimated to require aid. By the end of 2020, the Cox's Bazar district was still hosting more than 860,000 Rohingya refugees.
But why is the Rohingya crisis essential for us to know? How is it relevant to a course about crimmigration? To understand the Rohingya refugee crisis from a sociological lens, it's important to understand crimmigration itself. Crimmigration, in the simplest terms, refers to the intersection of criminal and immigration laws with the primary goal of regulating and policing immigrants and other people who belong to minority groups. Rohingya have been persecuted, being forced to leave their homes due to violence instilled by the government and other groups, being a prime example of crimmigration and discrimination that results from it. The phenomenon of crimmigration to the Rohingya crisis allows us to understand not only the intersections of race, class, gender, and religion in the geopolitical context, but also allows us to make connections and draw similarities between various other refugee crises throughout the world, both in the present and the past. It enables us to understand the foundations of these refugee crises. It shows us the hidden simplicities and the systemic discrimination that forces millions out of their homes and takes lives of many more. The Rohingya people have been persecuted, forced to leave their homes due to violence instilled by the government and other groups. The Rohingya massacre and refugee crisis is a prime example of the consequences of government propaganda and exploitation of the fear of the immigrant, ethno-minority groups, and the age of fear that results from it, which ultimately leads to the enforcement of harsher and overly restrictive measures involving the acceptance, settlement, and integration of new immigrants. It thus locks the immigrants in a never-ending cycle of repression and crime, and in Rohingya's case, a never-ending cycle of violence and genocide. Myanmar government has passed strict citizenship laws which denied the Rohingyas citizenship and essentially rendered them stateless. These exclusionary citizenship laws continued well into the late 1900s and early 2000s, where the persecution of Rohingyas only got worse, and since have forced nearly 50 million Rohingyas to flee their homes and have been displaced worldwide. These citizenship laws have been used to justify systemic exclusion of Rohingyas in various capacities. For example, the Rohingyas were excluded from the national census and were stripped of their status as an ethnic minority and the protections that come with the status. Similarly, various political events such as Operation Nagaman of 1978 led to the stripping of Rohingyas of their official documentation by interagency teams of inspectors, thus rendering them stateless. This lack of citizen status not only took away Rohingyas' legal protections, but also subjected them to state-sponsored violence in the form of abuses, including restrictions on their freedom of movement, discrimination on access to education, forced labor, and arbitrary confiscation of property, and an overall ethnic cleansing and genocide of this religious minority by the mono-religious nationalist state. Rohingya refugee crisis is definitely one that makes us question humanity. However, what is even saddening is that it's not one of a kind. Whether we look at the victims of the Syrian civil war or the African and Middle Eastern migrants journeying to what they think is a safe life in Europe, or even the Rohingyas through a sociological lens, the legal, symbolic, and structural violence turn out to be a common denominator. No matter the geographic region they belong to, these refugees face similar consequences of forced migration, which Berti, in his article, discusses. According to Berti, 5 significant intersectional challenges stem from refugee crises in the form of physical, mental, and legal protection, finding shelter and places to call home, lack of healthcare, lack of education, and finally finding employment and financial stability. In the context of Rohingyas in Myanmar, deliberate political, social, and economic isolation and decades of persecution in the form of state-sponsored violence, supplemented by legislative measures and endorsed by Buddhist monks, have resulted in difficulty to achieve any of those security. Furthermore, their intersectional identity as women, ethno-religious minority, and stateless makes the Rohingya women especially vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. Rohingya women are subjected to reproductive restrictions, and failure to comply can lead to violent and, in some cases, deadly consequences. In addition, Rohingya men, women, and especially children also become victims of exploitation, as they are forced to work long hours in inhumane conditions, and refusing to work can result in being killed by the Myanmar army and local police.
The fact remains that humans are not criminals, but unfortunately, this is far from reality. Migrants are seen and treated as criminals and not as human beings. They are stripped of their fundamental human rights and often are the targets of these harsh and discriminatory immigration laws. In the context of the countries they flee to, they are frequently perceived as inferior, less than, and not worth saving. This is the painful reality. So, what is being done? It is worth noting that although the United Nations issued a Refugee Convention in 1951, which laid out the laws and other regulations, including the rights of refugees, most countries hosting Rohingya refugees have not signed the convention. At the international level, according to the non-refoulement law, countries cannot send those seeking asylum back to their country of origin, but receiving countries have introduced other policies to avoid taking in the Rohingya. Countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia have adopted a help-along policy where they provide supplies to refugees in boats and send them to a third country, creating a ping-pong between countries and ultimately violating the principle of non-refoulement. However, due to a lack of accountability as these countries have not signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, as well as lack of national legal frameworks, they cannot be prosecuted for their actions. And until the conditions in Myanmar make it possible for Rohingya families to return home with basic human rights, that is citizenship, freedom of movement, health, education, and safety from violence, they remain as refugees living in overpopulated and dangerous conditions.